Here's a loan. In 1862, the government of Egypt borrowed £3.3 million on the London market. That is the number on the bond. That is the number that would be written in the ledger as Egypt's debt. The bonds were issued at 83% of face value, which means the buyers paid £83 for every £100 of debt Egypt owed. Then, the issuing houses took their commissions and fees off the top. What actually reached Cairo was somewhere around £2.25 million, and the amount Egypt would repay over the 30-year life of that loan, principal and interest together, came to something close to $8 million. So Egypt received 2.25 and paid back 8 on a bond that said 3.3. That is one loan. Between 1862 and 1875, there were about a dozen more, and each one got worse because a borrower in distress pays a distress price. Across the whole period, the Egyptian government borrowed roughly £53 million in nominal terms, received about $32 million in actual money, paid out about $35 million in debt service, and in 1876, having paid more than it ever received, still owed about $52 million. Now, the thing everyone knows about this story is that it ends with British troops in Egypt. What almost nobody explains is the part in between, which is a sequence of about 7 steps, each one of which was presented at the time as the solution to the previous one. That is what this is really about, not a conspiracy to seize Egypt, something stranger and more useful to understand, which is a collection process that ran out of remedies, and where the last remedy available was a fleet. Because here's the fact that breaks the simple version. The man who ordered the invasion of Egypt in 1882 was William Gladstone, and Gladstone had spent the previous 4 years touring Britain denouncing imperial adventurism, had won an election on it, and was personally, publicly, and sincerely opposed to exactly the thing he then did. He also, at the time, held a substantial personal holding of Egyptian bonds. Nobody in London woke up in 1882 and decided to take Egypt. The occupation was not a plan. It was a failure mode. And it lasted 74 years in part because nothing that had no beginning could easily be given an end. Let us walk down the staircase. Start with why Egypt was borrowing at all, because Ismail was not a fool, and the story is usually told as though he was. Ismail Pasha became Khedive of Egypt in 1863. He was the grandson of Muhammad Ali, the Albanian officer who had made Egypt effectively self-governing inside the Ottoman Empire and had begun the process of building a modern state. Ismail's ambition was to finish it. He said, more than once, that Egypt was no longer in Africa and had become part of Europe, and he meant it as a program rather than a boast. And he built. Under Ismail, Egypt's railway network expanded enormously. Telegraph lines went in. Thousands of miles of irrigation canals were dug, along with bridges and barrages on the Nile. Alexandria Harbor was rebuilt. Sugar refineries went up. Cairo was substantially remodeled, with the boulevards and the opera house and the districts that give the center of the city its shape today. Schools were opened, including schools for girls. The Postal Service, the museum, the National Library. He also, and this matters for what follows, tried to reduce Egypt's subordination to Istanbul, buying from the Ottoman Sultan a series of decrees that gave him greater autonomy, the right to borrow abroad in his own name, and a hereditary title in his direct line. Those decrees cost enormous sums in payments and tribute increases, and he had, for a few years, an extraordinary run of luck. The American Civil War cut off southern cotton from the mills of Lancashire. Egyptian cotton, which is very good cotton, filled the gap. Prices went to levels nobody had ever seen, Egyptian export earnings quadrupled, and it looked for a moment as though the country had found a permanent income. Then, in 1865, the American War ended, American cotton came back, and the price collapsed. That is the pivot. Ismail had a state-building program sized to boom revenues, and the boom had ended, and instead of cutting, he borrowed on the reasonable enough assumption that the Suez Canal, which opened in 1869, would soon produce a second income stream. Before going further, I want to be fair about where the money went, because the sympathetic version of Ismail is as misleading as the caricature. A great deal of it built things that Egypt still uses. A great deal of it did not. Ismail spent enormously on display. The opening ceremonies for the canal in 1869 involved building a palace for the Empress of France, entertaining several thousand European guests for weeks, and commissioning an opera house in Cairo. He kept a court on a scale that would have embarrassed most European monarchs. His personal estates grew to something like 1/10 of the cultivated land in Egypt. He also spent on empire. Egypt under Ismail pushed south, annexing Darfur in 1874 and pressing into the Red Sea coast and the Upper Nile. Then, in 1875 and 1876, he sent 2 expeditions into Ethiopia, and both were destroyed. Those wars produced nothing at all except casualties and bills. And he spent on Istanbul. The decrees that gave him the title of Khedive, the right to borrow in his own name and a hereditary succession in his direct line, were bought in cash and in permanently increased tribute. Ismail purchased greater independence from his Ottoman overlord with money borrowed in London, and the independence he purchased was the independence to borrow more. So the honest ledger has canals and railways and schools on one side, and an opera house, 2 lost wars in Ethiopia, and a title on the other. Both are real. What made it lethal was not the ratio between them, it was the price of the money. Because at an effective cost of borrowing that ran, on some of the later loans, past 20% once the discount and the fees and the short maturities were compounded, no program of any kind pays for itself. At those rates, a country cannot invest its way out. It cannot even stand still. The canal is where you see that most clearly, and this is where the arithmetic gets genuinely perverse. The canal concession had been granted by Ismail's predecessor to a French company under Ferdinand de Lesseps, on terms that were startlingly one-sided. Egypt supplied the land, Egypt supplied the labor, initially in the form of conscripted peasants working under the corvée, tens of thousands at a time, and Egypt subscribed for a very large block of the shares. Then, when the corvée was abolished under British diplomatic pressure in the early 1860s, the company demanded compensation for the loss of the free labor it had been promised, and an arbitration by Napoleon III ordered Egypt to pay it. Compensation for the labor, compensation for land returned, further damages. The total ran to something like 84 million francs. So Egypt paid to have the canal dug on its own territory, paid for the shares, and then paid the company compensation for not being allowed to use forced labor anymore. When the canal opened, Egypt had spent something in the region of 16 million pounds on it and held shares that paid nothing because the company was not yet distributing dividends. The canal was an asset that generated only outgoings, which brings us to step 1 of the staircase, and step 1 is the sale. By late 1875, Ismail had installments falling due in December and January that he could not meet. He had already pledged the land tax of entire provinces, the revenues of the railways, and his own estates. There was one unpledged thing left. He offered Egypt's Suez Canal shares for sale. He approached France first. Paris hesitated. In London, Benjamin Disraeli moved in days. Parliament was not sitting. Rather than wait, he borrowed 4 million pounds from Lionel de Rothschild, a personal friend, on what was by tradition a handshake, and bought the shares. The agreement was signed on the 25th of November, 1875. Egypt held out for 176,602 shares, which was nearly half the company's capital. Disraeli was attacked in Parliament afterward for having spent 4 million pounds of public money without any parliamentary authority at all, which was a completely fair criticism. He also, by any commercial measure, made the single best investment in the history of the British state. The shares appreciated for the next 40 years. But look at what step 1 actually did, because it is the pattern that repeats. Egypt sold its only remaining unencumbered asset to raise cash for a debt payment. The cash was spent within weeks on that payment. The debt itself was barely dented, and a foreign government that had previously been an interested observer was now a direct stakeholder in Egyptian solvency, holding nearly half of the company that ran the waterway through Egyptian territory. The sale did not solve the problem. It converted a financial exposure into a strategic one. Step 2 came 4 months later. In April 1876, Egypt suspended payments. That is the default, and it is the moment the story usually starts, but by then 2 of the 7 steps had already been taken. Britain sent Stephen Cave to examine the books. His report concluded that Egypt's difficulties came not from any lack of resources, but from the ruinous terms on which it had been lent money, which is a remarkable thing for a British commissioner to have written and then recommended foreign intervention in Egyptian finances anyway. What was set up was called the Caisse de la Dette Publique, the Fund of the Public Debt. It was a commission of foreign representatives, one each from Britain, France, Austria, and Italy at first, whose function was to receive Egyptian revenues assigned to debt service and distribute them to bondholders. Notice the structure. It was not an advisory body. Specified revenues, including the railway receipts, the customs, and the land tax of the most productive provinces, were paid directly to the Caisse, not to the Egyptian treasury and then onward, to the Caisse. The Egyptian government no longer collected a substantial part of its own income. Step 3 arrived in October of the same year, when George Goshen for the British bondholders and Edmond Joubert for the French came to Cairo and restructured the debt. The Goshen-Joubert settlement did 3 things. It consolidated the tangle of loans into a unified debt. It reduced the interest rate. And it installed 2 controllers general, one British and one French, one over revenue and one over expenditure. That is the arrangement known as the dual control, and it is worth being precise about what it was, because the phrase makes it sound like supervision. 2 officials appointed by and answerable to foreign governments now sat inside the Egyptian state with authority over what money came in and what money went out. They were not employed by Egypt. They were the standing representatives of the creditors placed inside the debtor. And step 4 is the one that shows what that actually meant. If you're finding this useful, subscribe, because this channel goes after the financial machinery underneath the events everyone thinks they already understand. Now let's watch a government be replaced by its own creditors. By 1878, the settlement was not working, because the revenue was not there, because the terms remained impossible. A new commission of inquiry was appointed, and one of its members was a British official named Evelyn Baring, who will matter enormously later under the name Lord Cromer. The inquiry's conclusion was that Ismail must cease to be an absolute ruler and become a constitutional one, and that his own estates, which were vast, must be surrendered to the state. Ismail agreed, and the cabinet formed in August 1878 is one of the strangest bodies in the history of the 19th century. The Minister of Finance of Egypt was an Englishman, Charles Rivers Wilson. The Minister of Public Works of Egypt was a Frenchman, Ernest de Blinière. Both were serving foreign officials. Contemporaries called it the European Cabinet. The two most consequential ministries in a country whose entire economy was irrigated agriculture. The one that collected the money and the one that dug the canals were held by nationals of the two countries the money was owed to. And what that cabinet did was austerity, because austerity was the only tool the position permitted. Taxes on the peasantry were raised and collected harder. The land tax was pushed, and in the countryside, collection meant the courbash, the hide whip, applied to villagers who had nothing left. Salaries of Egyptian officials went into arrears, and the army was cut, with thousands of officers placed on half pay or dismissed outright. It is worth being specific about what the collection actually was, because 60% of revenue is an abstraction, and the thing it rested on was not. Egyptian agriculture ran on a single annual cycle, and most fellahin held very little land. The land tax was assessed on the holding, regardless of what the harvest had done, which meant that in a bad year the tax did not fall. Only the ability to pay it did. Collection was carried out by officials with quotas, and a quota enforced on a village that has no money produces one of three outcomes. The family sells its animals. The family borrows from a moneylender at rates that will take the land within a few seasons, or the tax is taken out of somebody's back. The courbash was the standard instrument for the third. It was a whip of hippopotamus hide. Its use for tax collection was not an abuse of the system, it was the system, applied at village level across the country by men who would themselves be punished if the quota was short. There were also years in this period when taxes were demanded a season in advance, which for a subsistence cultivator means selling next year's crop at whatever price a lender will offer now. Follow that chain all the way up. A bond issued in London at 83% of face, paying a coupon to an investor in Manchester or Lyon, ultimately funded by a specific man in a Delta village being beaten because his cotton had come in short. That is not a rhetorical connection. It is the actual transmission mechanism, and every party in it was doing something legal. Hold on to the army, because that is where the whole thing detonates. In February 1879, a crowd of dismissed and unpaid Egyptian officers surrounded the finance ministry in Cairo and, by most accounts, roughed up Rivers Wilson and the Prime Minister. Ismail saw an opening. In April 1879, he dismissed the European ministers, appointed an Egyptian cabinet, and proposed his own settlement with creditors on terms Egypt could actually meet. This is the point at which a sovereign made the ordinary decision that sovereigns make, which is to decide that his own population came before his bondholders. Step 5 was his removal. Britain and France did not have the legal authority to depose the ruler of Egypt. Egypt was still formally an Ottoman province. So they went to the Sultan in Istanbul and applied pressure, and on the 26th of June, 1879, an imperial decree deposed Ismail and named his son Tewfik in his place. Ismail went into exile. He died in Istanbul in 1895. Tewfik was 26, and everyone involved understood exactly why he had been chosen. Step 6 is the Law of Liquidation of 1880, which is the document that set the terms the country would break on. It restructured the debt again, and it set the allocation. Roughly 60% of all Egyptian government revenue was assigned to debt service. The remainder, something under 40%, was what the Egyptian state had to run the country on: administration, army, courts, irrigation, everything. And the assignment was not a target. It was a legal instrument policed by foreign controllers, with the case collecting its source in international mixed courts established in 1876, in which foreigners could sue the Egyptian government and generally win. The mixed courts deserve a sentence of their own because they are the piece that made the rest enforceable. They grew out of the capitulations, the old Ottoman privileges under which foreign residents were subject to their own consuls rather than to local law. What the mixed courts added was a form in which a foreign creditor or contractor could bring a claim against the Egyptian state itself, before judges the majority of whom were foreign, applying codes drafted on European models. So a bondholder was not relying on the goodwill of the Egyptian government. He had a court. And the practical effect went well beyond debt. Foreign residents in Egypt were largely outside Egyptian taxation and outside Egyptian criminal jurisdiction, which meant that the growing European population of Alexandria and Cairo, tens of thousands of people running much of the country's commerce, contributed almost nothing to the revenue that the fellahin were being whipped to produce. Consider what a state actually is at that point. It has a ruler installed by foreign pressure. Its budget is divided by foreign statute. Its principal revenues are collected by a foreign commission. Its accounts are supervised by 2 foreign controllers. And its citizens can be sued in courts it does not control. Everything except the flag had been taken, and none of it by conquest. Every single step had been a negotiated remedy for a debt, which is what produced Ahmed Urabi. Urabi was born in 1841 in a village in the Delta, the son of a village sheikh. He was a fellah, a peasant, and that is the single most important fact about him. The Egyptian officer corps was dominated by a Turco-Circassian elite, the descendants of the Ottoman military caste that had run Egypt for centuries. Native Egyptians could enlist and could rise to a certain rank and then stopped. Urabi had reached colonel and understood that the ceiling was ethnic. So the grievance had 2 layers. The fact that they fused is what made the movement dangerous. Egyptian officers were blocked by a foreign-descended elite at home, and the whole country's revenue was being taken by foreign creditors abroad. And the austerity that fell on the army fell hardest on exactly the native officers who were already at the ceiling. In February 1881, Urabi and 2 other colonels petitioned for the dismissal of the war minister, equal treatment for Egyptian officers, and an expansion of the army. They were arrested, and their own troops broke them out. On the 9th of September 1881, Urabi drew up several thousand soldiers in front of the Abdin Palace in Cairo and demanded a constitution, an elected chamber, and a larger army. Tufik, with a British consul standing beside him, told Urabi that he was the Khedive and would do as he pleased with his country. Urabi's reply became the most famous sentence in modern Egyptian political history. He said that they were not slaves and would never from this day forth be inherited. The Khedive gave way. A chamber of deputies was convened, a new government formed. By early 1882, Urabi was Minister of War, and the movement's slogan was Egypt for the Egyptians. Now, what did that government actually want? Because this is where the British case and the Egyptian case diverge, and both have something to them. It wanted a constitution, and it wanted the chamber to have control over the budget, specifically over the roughly 40% not assigned to the debt. It did not, in its official positions, propose to repudiate the debt. It proposed that Egyptians should decide how Egyptian money was spent. That was intolerable to the controllers for an obvious structural reason. If an elected Egyptian chamber controlled the budget, then next year it might vote to spend differently, and the 60% was only safe as long as nobody Egyptian had a vote on it. On the 8th of January, 1882, Britain and France sent a joint note affirming their support for the Khedive's authority against the chamber. It is difficult to overstate how badly that misjudged the room. It converted a domestic constitutional argument into a national one, and it made Urabi, overnight, the man standing against foreign dictation. Step 7 took about 5 months. In May 1882, a British and French fleet anchored off Alexandria as a demonstration. The demonstration did not intimidate anyone. It raised the temperature in a city already full of rumor, and it convinced Urabi's officers that an invasion was coming, so they began fortifying the harbor, which the fleet then treated as a provocation. On the 11th of June, 1882, riots broke out in Alexandria. Somewhere around 50 Europeans were killed, mostly Greeks, Italians, and Maltese, and a larger number of Egyptians died as well. Who started it has been argued about ever since. The Egyptian nationalist account holds it was provoked. The British account treats it as evidence of anarchy. What is not disputed is that the fleet was already there when it happened. On the 11th of July, after an ultimatum to dismantle the harbor batteries was refused, the British Mediterranean fleet bombarded Alexandria for over 10 hours. The French squadron sailed away rather than take part, which is why the occupation that followed was British alone. The batteries were silenced. Fires spread through the city and much of the European quarter burned. Egyptian casualties are usually put in the hundreds killed. British losses were 6. The days after the bombardment are contested, and the contest matters. British accounts of the burning of Alexandria attribute it to Egyptian troops and mobs looting and setting fires as the city fell into disorder. Egyptian accounts attribute it to the shelling itself and to the fires it started, which spread unchecked because the city's administration had collapsed and the fire service had fled. Both things almost certainly happened, and there is no neutral reconstruction available. What is not contested is that a city of a few 100,000 people, the second city of Egypt and its main port, was substantially destroyed in the course of an operation whose stated purpose was the dismantling of harbor defenses that had been built because a foreign fleet had anchored offshore. British Marines landed on the 13th of July and occupied what was left. Urabi declared the Khedive a traitor and organized resistance. Tufik took shelter with the British. The invasion proper came in August, when Garnet Wolseley landed a force at Ismailia on the canal, which he had seized, and advanced west. On the night of the 12th of September, his army marched in darkness across the desert and attacked the Egyptian entrenchments at Tel el-Kebir at first light. It lasted under an hour. British losses were 57 killed. Egyptian losses were around 2,000. Cairo surrendered 2 days later. Arabi was captured, tried, sentenced to death, and had the sentence commuted to exile in Ceylon. The bondholders' collection process now had a garrison. If you're getting something out of this, hit subscribe, because the next part is the question that actually matters, which is why it took 74 years to leave. Britain did not annex Egypt. It never annexed Egypt. That is not a technicality, it is the center of the thing. Egypt remained in law an Ottoman province with its own khedive, its own ministers, its own flag, and its own government. What Britain established was what its own officials called the Veiled Protectorate. There was a British agent and consul general in Cairo whose formal status was that of a diplomat, and Egyptian ministers who took his advice because a British army was in the country. The man who held that post from 1883 to 1907 was Evelyn Baring, by then Lord Cromer, the same official who had sat on the 1878 Commission of Inquiry. For 24 years, he effectively ran Egypt while holding no Egyptian office at all, and Britain said, repeatedly and formally, that it was leaving. The declarations of intention to withdraw from Egypt, made by British governments to other powers between 1882 and 1922, are usually counted at around 66. 66 times, over 40 years, His Majesty's government stated that the occupation was temporary, and that British forces would be withdrawn as soon as circumstances permitted. They were not lying, at least not at first. Gladstone's cabinet genuinely intended a short stay. So why did it never happen? Here is the mechanism, and it is the whole point of this story. The occupation existed to make the debt payable. Making the debt payable required a functioning Egyptian administration that produced surpluses. Producing surpluses required control of taxation, irrigation, and expenditure, which meant that the moment Britain achieved the condition for leaving, a solvent Egypt, that solvency was a British production which would collapse if Britain left. And if it collapsed, France and the other creditor powers would be back at the table, and Britain would have spent blood and money to hand the position to its rivals. The occupation could not end while the debt existed, and the debt could not be safely retired without the occupation. Cromer's administration was genuinely competent at the narrow task it set itself. The corvée was largely abolished, the courbash was suppressed as a method of tax collection, the irrigation system was rebuilt and extended, the first Aswan Dam completed in 1902, and the cultivated area expanded substantially. The budget was balanced by 1888, and Egypt's credit recovered. And what did not happen is at least as revealing. Spending on Egyptian education stayed very low throughout, on the reasoning that an educated Egyptian class produced nationalists, and, more directly, that education did not service debt. Egyptian industry was not encouraged because the arrangement worked best with Egypt as a cotton exporter and an importer of manufactures. Egyptians were kept out of senior administrative posts, so the country got dams and solvency and did not get schools or an industrial base or a trained civil service, and it is not a coincidence which side of that line things fell on. The administration optimized for the thing it was there for. The clearest single case is cotton, and it is worth following because the consequences ran for the next century. The irrigation works were genuinely impressive engineering. What they were engineered for was perennial irrigation, meaning year-round water rather than a single flood season, and the crop that perennial irrigation makes possible, on that scale, is long, staple cotton. Cotton was the export. Cotton earned the foreign currency. Foreign currency serviced the debt, so every incentive in the system pushed Egyptian agriculture further toward a single cash crop grown for a single market. By the early 20th century, cotton was the overwhelming majority of Egyptian export earnings, and Egypt, a country whose entire history is agricultural surplus, had become a net importer of food. That is a specific kind of vulnerability. A country in that position does not control its own income. The price of its one export is set in Liverpool, and when that price falls, as it did catastrophically in 1907 and again in the 1930s, the entire national budget falls with it, and there is nothing else to fall back on. Nobody sat down and decided to make Egypt a cotton monoculture dependent on imported grain. It is what you get when a country's economy is optimized patiently and competently over decades for the production of hard currency by an administration whose reason for existing is a debt. Now let me give the British case, because there is one. Egypt in 1882 was genuinely in a state of collapse, and Urabi's movement, whatever its merits, had not demonstrated it could govern. 50 European civilians were killed in Alexandria in June. Britain had actual strategic interests in the canal, through which around 80% of the traffic was British, and which was the route to India. And a great deal of the borrowing had in fact been squandered on palaces, on a disastrous war in Ethiopia, on the Sudan, and on payments to Istanbul that bought Ismail's family a hereditary title. The bondholders' money was, in the ordinary sense, owed. Nobody forced Ismail to sign. And the administration that followed did improve the material condition of Egyptian agriculture in measurable ways, and Egyptians stopped being whipped for tax arrears, which is not a small thing to have ended. All of that is true. But I do not think the interesting question is whether Britain was justified, because that argument has been running for 140 years, and it turns entirely on where you think the burden of proof sits. The more useful question is a different one. What in this sequence was actually decided by anybody? Go back through the 7 steps. Disraeli buying the shares was a decision, and a shrewd one, and it was made in days for reasons of commercial opportunity, not as a step toward occupation. The Caisse was a technical mechanism for distributing payments. Dual control was a debt restructuring instrument. The European cabinet was a reform demanded by an inquiry. Ismail's deposition was a creditor protecting its position. The law of liquidation was an accounting settlement, and the fleet at Alexandria was sent as a demonstration to steady a situation by a cabinet that did not want to invade. Not one of those steps was a decision to take Egypt. Every one of them was a decision to secure a payment, and the cumulative effect of securing payments was a foreign army in Cairo for 74 years. That is the thing worth taking away, and it is not comfortable because it does not require anybody to be a villain. It requires only that, at each stage, the most reasonable available action was the one that protected the creditor, and that nobody was responsible for the shape of the whole. There was no decision to occupy Egypt. That is precisely why there was never a decision to leave. The endpoint took an extremely long time to arrive. Formal British protectorate was declared in 1914 when the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the other side. That was the moment the veil came off, and it came off because the legal fiction had depended on Ottoman sovereignty, and the Ottomans were now the enemy. The war itself was what broke the arrangement, and not because of anything that happened on a battlefield in Egypt. Egypt was used as a base. Hundreds of thousands of imperial troops passed through it, and the British administration requisitioned. It requisitioned grain, animals, and cotton at fixed prices, and it conscripted something like 500,000 Egyptians into a labor corps and a camel transport corps to dig and carry for the campaign in Palestine in a country where the corvée had supposedly been abolished 30 years earlier. So a generation of Egyptian villagers experienced forced labor and confiscated crops, imposed by an administration whose stated justification for existing was that it had ended exactly those things. In November 1918, a week after the armistice, a delegation of Egyptian notables led by Saad Zaghloul, a former Minister of Education, called on the British High Commissioner and asked for permission to travel to London to discuss independence. The word for delegation in Arabic is waft, and it became the name of the party that dominated Egyptian politics for the next 30 years. They were refused. In March 1919, Zaghloul and 3 colleagues were arrested and deported to Malta. What followed was the largest popular rising in modern Egyptian history to that point. It was not confined to Cairo, and it was not confined to any class. Students, lawyers, transport workers, and government clerks struck. Railway and telegraph lines were cut across the country. Villages rose. Women demonstrated publicly in Cairo in numbers that had no precedent. Something like 800 Egyptians were killed suppressing it. Britain released Zaghloul, sent an inquiry, and in February 1922 issued a unilateral declaration granting Egypt independence, while reserving 4 matters: imperial communications, defense, the protection of foreigners and minorities, and the Sudan. Read that reservation list again. Imperial communications means the canal. Protection of foreign interests means the debt and the capitulations. Britain granted independence and retained the 2 things the occupation had been for. A treaty in 1936 reduced the British military presence to the Canal Zone. Egyptian officers overthrew the monarchy in 1952. The last British troops left the Suez Canal Zone in June 1956, 74 years after Tel el-Kebir. 5 weeks later, on the 26th of July 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. Follow that all the way back. The shares Nasser was seizing were, in large part, the shares Ismail had sold to Disraeli in November 1875 to meet a debt installment falling due the following month. The installment was paid, the debt was not cleared, and the sale put a British government inside the company, which gave Britain a stake in Egyptian solvency, which is one of the threads that pulled the fleet to Alexandria 7 years later. Nasser was reversing a transaction from 81 years earlier that had bought Egypt about 6 weeks, and Arabi, the peasant colonel, came home from Ceylon in 1901. He was allowed back as a broken man, tolerated rather than welcomed, blamed by respectable Egyptian opinion for having brought the occupation down on the country. He died in Cairo in 1911, obscure. Then, in the 1950s, another Egyptian officer of modest origins took power, looked back for a predecessor, and found him. Nasser's government rehabilitated Urabi completely, put him in the school books, and made the sentence he said at the Abdin Palace into a national text. "We are not slaves, and we will never from this day forth be inherited." He said it to a Khedive who was standing next to a British consul, 75 years before the last British soldier left, in a country whose budget had already been divided in a room in London. If you want to see what happened when the same country, the same canal, and the same creditor relationship came round again in the 20th century, watch our video on Suez in 1956, where Britain discovered what it feels like to be the one with the payment schedule.